Welcome to the 2017 Constitution Day Lecture at Holy Cross. This evening's lecture is generously sponsored by Delta Epsilon Sigma, College Honor Society. It is my distinct privilege this evening to introduce our guest speaker, Patrick Griffin. Professor Griffin is the Madden Hennebrey Professor of History at Notre Dame, a position he's held since 2008. He has also served the university as the chair of the history department since 2011. Professor Griffin has research and teaching interests in colonial revolutionary America, British, Irish, and the Atlantic world. In these areas, he has focused on revolution and rebellion, movement and migration, colonization and violence in comparative perspective. He has already established an impressive pace of publications, and I'm being very selective here. In 2001, The People with No Name appeared. In 2007, The American Leviathan. In 2012, America's Revolution, published by Oxford Press. And this year, The Townsend Movement. So please help me in giving a warm Holy Cross welcome to Patrick Griffin.
Thank you for coming out this evening, on a beautiful evening. I do appreciate it. Before I start, I just want to say one thing. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and also for the wonderful introduction. If half of it's true, I'll be a happy man. You know, looking at all the young folks out here, Christmas time is nearly here. And it's never too early to start thinking about what you're going to get for your parents. Okay? And this book will be appearing very, very soon. So if you want to go to Amazon and order it now, okay, they'll be very happy, but more importantly, I'll be very happy. So I'm here to talk about the Constitution. You know, and at first, when you think about the Constitution, what is there really to say about it? Okay? We all know, we've all read it, we all understand that we can place it in some kind of historical context, but when it comes to the sum total of making sense of it, you look at this image here, and this almost sums up the way that we think about the Constitution. It was a bunch of guys, many with revolutionary experience, who were coming together in a hot, shuttered, musty room in Philadelphia, and cobbling together what they hoped to be was going to be a new frame of government, the one that we've been living with since that moment in time. This room, of course, is in Philadelphia. Here at a place we know today as Independence Hall. It wasn't known as Independence Hall then. It was called Pennsylvania State House. It was built in the 1750s. This is where the Declaration of Independence was signed. This is where the Constitutional Convention met, right in this room here, the Assembly Room. And pretty much, if you understand that, you get a good sense of what makes America tick and what its revolution was all about. You see, ultimately, the Constitution, as we know, is the founders' document. If there's anything we think about with the Founding Fathers, it's something like the Constitution. We think, for example, of James Madison, the Virginian who really more or less laid out the central tenets of what that Constitution was going to be about, who came up with some brilliant insights about framing it, brilliant insights about intractable issues that they were struggling to make sense of. Madison was the guy who was able to make sense of it. So it's more or less his document. But there were others involved too, and you know them all. Benjamin Franklin. Now, he was well past prime at this time. He was well past prime at this time. This wasn't the young Benjamin Franklin who was able to swim across the Delaware River as a young man. No, this was old, ill, gouty Benjamin Franklin. As a matter of fact, every day he had to be borne aloft on a sedan chair to go to the assembly room because his gout was so bad. And this way you could make the bumpy ride a lot easier. He didn't have much to say there, but Madison knew it was critically important that he be there. because people then would understand that this thing had meaning. And who was going to preside? None other than the father of our country, George Washington. Madison really wanted him there. Because if you brought Washington in, immediately you get street cred. You get legitimacy right from the get-go if you have him there. And then we have kind of like the immediate aftermath, the afterlife of the Constitution. And still it's more founders. It's like a parade of founders. Alexander Hamilton had a certain vision of the Constitution. In short, he liked it and wanted it passed. He liked a strong central government. But he's the guy we look at in the years just after. He too was there at the Constitutional Convention. He has a more important role to play after the convention. Musical or no musical, he is a pretty important guy. And then, of course, you have Thomas Jefferson. He wasn't there. Okay? He happened to be in Paris at the time. When he came back, wow, he was a little bit upset at what they had dreamt up while he was away in Philadelphia. Nonetheless, he's going to accept this thing, but then he's going to be tussling with Hamilton about the afterlife and the meaning of what it is. In other words, when we think about this document, all we have to do is focus upon these personages, and then you understand it. You don't have anything else to talk about. I don't think this is so much wrong, but it's a little wrong-headed. I think, you see, we give these founders too much credit, too much agency, as it were. That's the historical term. Now, I'm not here to kind of, wipe out the founders, cut out their legs, tell you that these guys are a bunch of rotten so-and-sos. That's been done already. That's kind of a historian's trick to do that kind of thing. No, I'm up to something a little more complex. I want to put these founders in their proper context. And when we do, we begin to see that these founders are really no different than anybody else. They had to negotiate an extraordinarily fraught context. They had to deal with all kinds of constraints as they imagined new possibilities. They also had to sign on to what were going to be dirty, awful bargains when it came to drawing up this Constitution. Before we can understand the Constitution and put the founders in their proper perspective, it means we have to understand first and foremost what this thing was meant to do. This thing was meant to bring a revolution to a close. It was meant to bring a revolution to a close. Now, you may be saying, I came out here this evening to hear you say that. I kind of know that already. And I say, no, you don't. Because this isn't the revolution, the American Revolution as we think about it. That's the Founders' Revolution. That's the Declaration of Independence. That's the Constitution. That's sticking us in this stuffy room. We're going to go outside that room and appreciate what the revolution was. The American Revolution wasn't just a war for independence. The American Revolution was a moment when sovereignty was twisted, contorted, turned upside down, and a people had to compete with one another to reconstitute that sovereignty. People had to compete with one another to say, what kind of place is this going to be in the wake of fear, uncertainty, and sometimes appalling violence? In order to understand what happened in this room again, we have to go outside of it and appreciate what was going on in America at the time, and to see the distinctive tensions the founders, like all people, were trying to deal with at the time. In doing so, I hope to give you a different appreciation of what this document actually is. Let's start first with the context, the immediate context. Well, what was America like at this time? All right, well, I think that there's one episode that more or less kind of sums up what was happening in these new United States with plural, not with singular. What was happening in these new United States? Well, in order to understand that, I want to tell you a little story about the Battle of Yorktown, but more importantly, the aftermath of the Battle of Yorktown. The year is 1781. The British have started a new strategy of trying to go to the south to finally try to do something to win this war, or at least bring Americans to the bargaining table, hoping to chip away the southern states from the middle colonies and from the northern part of the country. It had failed dismally. I'll talk about why in a few minutes. Nonetheless, they make their way back to Virginia, and when they're in Virginia, they're pillaging, they're plundering, they're burning tobacco, they're destroying shipping, they're doing anything they can to cause general revolutionary mayhem. And then in October, they're going to withdraw then for the season. They're done fighting for that year. They're going to withdraw their armies and figure out what we're going to do from this point because our latest strategy just hasn't worked. Okay, and so they go to this little place called Yorktown in one of the peninsulas in the Tidewater region of Virginia. There, they're expecting that the Northern British Army is going to protect their exposed flank, and eventually the British Navy can come in. They can evacuate the men, bring them back up to Halifax. Everybody can drink their beer, and they can go back to the table and figure out what to do. Only it doesn't work out. George Washington finally realizes he has the one opportunity he ever had before, and he finally is able to get the French off their rear end and to help with the war effort. And so the French and the Americans come down from the north. They're able to surround the British that are there in Yorktown with their back to the seas. And just at that moment, a French fleet is able to come in and bottle up the Chesapeake and to box the British out. And then the siege begins. The siege begins, and soon enough, the British have to surrender. And they surrendered with honor. In the 18th century, if you kind of put up with the siege for a certain period of time, if the mortars were within range, okay, and after that point, you could surrender, and you could surrender with honor. This was kind of normal military protocol. But what I want you to take evidence here from is what happens after the surrender. And this painting sums it up. Okay, so the British are surrendering here at Yorktown. And this is a painting by John Trumbull that recognizes that. The funny thing here is you would imagine this is George Washington's moment. Well, George is there, but notice he's in the background. He's in the background of this painting for a very important reason. When Cornwallis surrendered, the next day he called in sick. He didn't want to hand over his sword. That was part of the military protocol. You hand your sword over to the victor. So he gave it to one of his subordinates, an Irishman by the name of O'Hara. And O'Hara was instructed not to give the sword over to Washington, but to give it over to a Frenchman. So he walks over with the sword to a Frenchman, and the French are aghast. They won't take it. They say this is Washington's moment. He deserves to take this surrender. So O'Hara moves over to Washington, and Washington refuses. How could he take it from a subordinate? There's no way. And so he asks one of his subordinates, Benjamin Lincoln, to come and to take the sword. After this moment happened, the British then are able to withdraw with honors from the battlefield, and as they did so, a story began to make a circulation. A story began to make the rounds that they played a tune on their drums, on their muffled drums that were draped in black as they were leaving. And that name of that tune was "The World Turned Upside Down." Now, we don't know whether this actually happened or not, but this is one of those instances in history where what might have happened is probably better than what did happen. Because in many ways, this tune that was played sums up what had happened in America in these years. The world was completely turned upside down. Now, the tune itself holds a clue for what that means. The tune was a 17th century English tune that referred to something called the Feast of Fools. And the Feast of Fools was a day when you had these strange kind of inversions, when like jesters became mayors. Or as the song put it, what happens when the grass eats the ponies? What happens when the grass eats the cows? And the horses ride the men? This is a perverse world where everything is completely transformed from what we know. That is the most important thing to understand. The immediate context of what went on before the founders met in the Constitutional Hall. They were facing a world turned upside down. How was it turned upside down? Society had been ripped open in these years. This is a society that experienced unparalleled violence. Violence that it had never seen before. New people had played roles they hadn't seen before. All of the normal deferential norms of society had been thrown out the window. Things that occurred that people in 1763 would have said were literally unimaginable. That is what had happened. As well as being ripped open, there were other things that happened as well. There were all kinds of tangible issues that were flummoxing people at this moment. Let me go through a few of these issues. Some of these you've heard, some of these you've not heard. Well, there was one issue I think that they had in their favor. If you want to bring a society back to order after a revolution, there's one very important ingredient. Don't have any counter-revolutionaries around. This always confounded the French. Counter-revolutionaries, aristocrats, people who hated the idea of what the revolution was, they always gunked up the works. They always destroyed the possibility of people creating some kind of common political culture. Now, Americans had an advantage. Most of their counter-revolutionaries left. Loyalists, between a fifth to a third of the population at the time of the war, those people who were Americans who remained loyal to the crown, the vast majority of them end up leaving. So about 80,000 loyalists leave America right at the end of the War of Independence. Where do they go? Some of them then go to the Caribbean islands. Wealthier ones go off to Britain. Poorer ones from the north are making their way to places like Nova Scotia, or they're heading to Canada at the time. As a matter of fact, the Canadian-American border for a time is really going to be a line running between two Americas. A Republican America in the south and a loyalist America up in the north. But when they go, all of a sudden these Americans who remain, those Republicans, have a chance of actually restoring some kind of order. But there were other things that were getting in the way. So many things that maybe they wish they had a few more loyalists around to deal with. What was one issue? Debt. The debt was huge. Now, Americans had all kinds of continental scrip, money, currency that was out there. It was absolutely worthless, completely worthless. How much it was out there? Face value, $226 million. $226 million. Well, what do you do about this? You know what? You just write it off, and that's what they did. They wrote it off. Benjamin Franklin was the wisest. He said, look. Said, what are we going to do? How can we write this off? He says, look, consider it a tax on the people for independence. They'll understand. It's just going to be a tax on the people. We've had to pay our dues. That's what it's going to be. But that was the least of the worries. It's one thing bilking your own people. All right? You can tell them it's revolutionary sacrifice. You know what you can't bilk? International banks. That's what you can't bilk. What were their debts to foreign nations and foreign lenders? $27 million. This had to be paid back. This had to be paid back. Moreover, that's what the central government, the Continental Congress, owed. What did the states owe? States owed a lot of money too. Virginia owed 4 million pounds. Massachusetts, 1.5 million pounds. And how are they dealing with this? You still got to pay your interest. They don't have much money coming in. You know what they do? They get into debt to pay off their debt. That's what they do. It's almost like getting another credit card to pay off a credit card. They're just trying to keep afloat, and they're trying to, if you will, keep bankruptcy at bay. But this is a massive problem, and it's one that people don't quite know how to wrap their minds around. There are other issues. The second one, the economy is completely in shambles. It's in shambles. By 1790, by some estimates, it would only be operating at kind of like half power from where it was at about 1760. Okay? That's a lot of problem right there. Trade had dried up. The most important markets for these Americans before the war had been the Caribbean islands. But after the war, the British boxed them out of these islands. They don't allow that trade to resume. The markets are gone, the currency is depreciated, the economy's in bad shape. There's other issues as well. When the Americans signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they promised to pay back some of the claims of these loyalists who had fled. Okay? They had money, they had property, these are going to have to be paid back. But the Americans are not much in a mood, considering the economic problems they have, of paying the loyalists back. Who can blame them? I'll tell you who. The British can. And the British are going to hold them accountable to the terms of the treaty. And they're basically going to say, until you take care of these treaty terms, we are not going to leave some Western ports. Okay? So what you see there is more or less kind of what America is going to look like after 1763. America had gained a massive amount of land. They had gained all that territory up to the Mississippi River. They didn't think they were going to even come away with that much, but ultimately they did. But the problem is at key portage points here, at important areas, the British had frontier posts. And they're not going to leave those posts until Americans make good on their treaty obligations. In other words, America may claim to be sovereign, but now you've got a power that you just defeated on your sovereign territory. To make matters worse, we now know that the British are actually encouraging Native Americans in those regions to raid frontier settlements, to keep up a level of disturbance, to ensure that Americans are going to follow through on treaty obligations. When this is happening then, and now we get to another problem, there's a legitimate fear of Western secession. The first threat of secession didn't come from the South trying to leave the North at the time of the Civil War. If you were a betting person, okay, in about 1790, and you were going to say, how's secession going to work out? You would have said the West is going to break away from the East. Why? The federal government couldn't protect them. The British were in forts. They couldn't do any sort of trade. On the western side of the Mississippi, the Spanish control the land. They also control the river. And they're not allowing Americans to use the Mississippi River. And so lots of Americans are getting upset. People in Vermont are talking to the British about kind of coming back into the empire. People in Kentucky are talking to the Spanish about joining the Spanish Empire. People in places like Pennsylvania and other parts of Western Virginia are talking about actually creating a new Western Republic. These are also issues now that are stymieing Americans at this point. These are important problems. These are problems about territory. These are problems about sovereignty. These are problems about solvency. But the government couldn't possibly solve these sorts of problems. Americans were plagued by a weak government. Now we know the Articles of Confederation. We think about these things as kind of the first frame of government. I bet you think about the Articles as being the Constitution before the Constitution. That's the way they were kind of taught to think about it. But I think a better way of thinking about the Articles of Confederation, it was almost a provisional government, or it was a treaty government. It tied together a bunch of independent states that had, to a certain extent, a sort of common culture. But that was it. They were still independent states, much like France is a state, Germany is a state, Britain is a state. At that time, Virginia was a state, Pennsylvania was a state, Massachusetts was a state. So when we think sometimes about the United States and the whole idea, we can lose sight of that. These were independent entities. They had largely been yoked to one another, not by kind of ties between them, but through the British center. They were almost like different spokes on a wheel, and they were tied to each other that way, but not directly. As a matter of fact, if you read about American travel logs at this time, what you find is fascinating stuff. They are baffled by people in other regions. So this one guy who's fighting in the army at the time said, he was from Connecticut, and he said, hey, it's great to go out and fighting for an American nation. And then he ran into some of the other people in the Continental Army. He said, you won't believe the people you see. Some of them aren't even like really people. He said, those folks from Pennsylvania, forget it. They're outlandish. You can't even understand what they're saying. He said, all I hear is different languages every day, different accents every day, and I can't understand any of them. And that doesn't even begin to touch on what Virginians are like. These were alien peoples. And the Articles of Confederation reflected that. It was signed at the time of the Revolution so that these colonies tied together, these states tied together, could actually fight a common foe. It's somewhere in a cross between NATO and the European Union. And if you know anything about the European Union now, just imagine Brussels trying to deal with the problems I've been talking about. It's not going to be very good. And on top of it, there's one other problem. Americans come about this close to a coup d'etat. We think that coups, military coups, are kind of the stuff that happened in Latin American countries in the 20th century. Or if you've been watching the Vietnam special, happens to South Vietnam time and time again in the mid to late 1960s. But the United States almost experienced a coup early on. And this is a story worth telling. Okay? Story worth telling. What happens is this. Amidst all the problems I'm talking about, there were a bunch of officers who were stationed at a barracks in Newburgh, New York, up from New York City, who were getting incensed by what was happening and the failure of the government to address these things. Some of them then say, we are the only people with the proper experience who can actually do something in this government, can actually make it efficacious and can make it work, but we have to be running things. A congressman from Virginia gets wind of what's happening, and he sends off a feverish letter to George Washington. And in the letter, he tells Washington, you got to look out, there's something stirring. I don't quite know what it is, but this could be bad for the United States. And so Washington heads up to Newburgh, where he goes to meet all of the men that he had served with in the late war. And he gets up to speak. And as he gets up to speak, he talks about the sacrifices he had to make. He talks about what this war was all about, to remind them again why they had fought and why they had sacrificed. And at a certain moment in the speech, he reaches into his pocket and he takes out a letter. This is a letter from the congressman in Virginia. And he starts to read it. But as he starts to read it, he fumbles in his other pocket and he picks out a set of eyeglasses. And he puts on the eyeglasses and he starts to read. Now to us this means nothing, but to George Washington it meant a great deal. George Washington was one of these people who prided himself on his manhood, his virility, on his self-command. Eyeglasses were not what a gentleman wore, particularly the type of gentleman that George Washington always aspired to be and the way he always fashioned himself. They were a sign of weakness. And when he put them on, he revealed immediately to these men his weakness. And he said, gentlemen, you may be stunned by this, but I'm afraid I haven't only lost my treasure and my health in this late war, I fear I've also lost my eyesight. Coup over. Coup over at that point. If Washington had sacrificed so much, what the heck were they complaining about? But that gives you a sense of how this country was on a knife edge at that moment. There were other intangible issues also that were happening out of doors. Some I alluded to already. The violence. We don't normally think of the American Revolution as a violent revolution. We think of like the French Revolution with the terror, the guillotine, those kinds of things. We don't usually think of the American Revolution that way because, I would argue, we have so consistently been transfixed with the founders and we've made the revolution their revolution. But some areas suffered appalling violence. New Jersey, the Garden State, was halfway divided between loyalists and patriots. And because of that, the story of the revolution in New Jersey was kind of one murderous raid after another. New York City was a center of loyalism throughout the war, almost like a loyalist rock of Gibraltar. But in the areas just around it, in northern New Jersey, in Westchester, parts of Long Island, it was a theater of appalling violence. And that doesn't even touch on some of the worst parts. The West, Kentucky, was a place that per capita had the highest death rate of any place in America. Once especially the British began launching raids against patriot settlements near the end of the war, this place heated up. Armies tromped through, killed Indians. Indians killed settlers. This place was a scene of incredible devastation. And probably the worst area was the Deep South. Not the Deep South, the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. Now remember I said before that Cornwallis had made his way to Virginia after a failed British strategy of trying to win over the South. They had hoped that they could win over a bunch of loyalists in those areas. Loyalists who had fled to London and said, look, this place is filled with people who are loyal to the crown. And if you can win them over and hold the territory, they'll hold it for you. You can move the army and you can pacify one section after another. And as you do, they'll almost fall like loyalist dominoes. This would be the plan. Didn't work out that way. Well, they were loyalists, all right. They weren't the kind of loyalists that you wanted to kind of pin any order with. They were loyalists because the neighbors they hated happened to be patriots. And when the British came in, they stirred a hornet's nest. And people practiced unspeakable incidents of violence upon one another at this time. People were appalled by what was happening in the Carolinas. The British couldn't believe what went on, and they realized we can't control this place. But this defined much of America in the years of the Revolution. this sort of violence. How do you put that back in a cage? These things you could call the furies, the anger, the hatred, the things that had happened in the past. How do you cage them again? There was other intangible issues also. People had played all kinds of roles they were not accustomed to in the years after British sovereignty had collapsed. From 1765 on, many American cities and many American towns were turned upside down. It was difficult to say who actually had legitimate legal authority in these places. And as that happened, people then stepped forward and they started playing new roles. For the most part, politics in colonial America was an elite sort of affair. It was usually the largest landholder, the wealthy, the well-born. They may not have had titles, okay? But it was almost a virtual aristocracy to a certain extent. And they were the people who ruled. And there was a sense, anyway, that you owed them some sort of deference. Well, when British authority begins crumbling in places, Americans quickly put up local institutions. They put their own committees. And these committees are not necessarily staffed by the wealthy and well-heeled. They're staffed by those with best patriotic credentials. But these people hadn't played roles before. There are others as well. Women. Women play extraordinarily important roles when British sovereignty begins to collapse, as Americans now are contesting what the British are doing. They do so because so much of the resistance against the British in the late 1760s and early 1770s was premised upon consumer goods. And that put women right at the heart of patriotic resistance. Well, what happens now? Are women now going to play political roles they hadn't played in the past? One state said yes early on. New Jersey is going to allow those women who are of age and single, in other words, who are not under the laws of coverture, that means they're covered by their husband, okay? They're going to actually have the right to vote. And this was debated at the time. And it was said, given the ethos of the time and given what women have done in this society, it only makes sense. So you're going to have that issue now. What are you going to do with women? What are you going to do with slaves? The American Revolution amounted to probably the greatest, as one historian calls it anyway, the greatest slave rebellion in American history. Why? Large numbers of slaves, first off, ran away to fight with the British. That's one thing. Wherever the British went, particularly in the South, the one thing that they wanted to do was destabilize the plantation system, destabilize the economies there. And the best way to do that was to offer slaves freedom if they went and fought with the British. And so you have, for example, the Royal Ethiopians. You have the Black Pioneers. You have black regiments that are formed and raised from people who had run away from the condition of slavery. Now, this doesn't mean, I want to disabuse you of this, that the British were emancipators. They were not. Okay? They made their money, this empire made its money on slave labor, particularly in the Caribbean, on islands like Jamaica and Barbados. They didn't want to free all slaves, that's for sure. But they realized, tactically speaking, this made sense in America at the time. So where the British armies go, the slaves run away. Moreover, when they do have the opportunity, slaves are running from other plantations and other areas. The slave economy was more or less in shambles, but now you have people who have tasted freedom before. What's going to happen to them? How are you going to deal with Indians? Indians also had risen up on the frontier. Indians also had fought. Very few Indians are going to fight on the American side, and with good reason, because the Americans, generally speaking, are after the land they happen to be living on. Now, the British didn't necessarily offer much of a better deal, but they realized that probably casting their lot with the British was the best way of holding on to their land after the war would end. Generally, Native Americans referred to the white colonists, the patriots then, as the Long Knives, Okay, and so Native Americans now are rising up. What are you going to do now in light of this? Common whites, as I mentioned before, have played unprecedented political roles, okay, in America during the Revolution. They had also borne arms. The army. Many served in militia. Many are going to serve in the Continental Army. Now, don't get the idea that the Continental Army was kind of something that one inspired you. The Continental Army was something you joined if you were completely down on your luck, and you didn't have any other viable alternative. The Army was, by and large, 50% an immigrant army. 1/3 of the Army was actually Irish that fought for the Continentals. They fought as Irish, not because they only hated the British, that helps, that's for sure. But because, as being Irish, they were considered the lowest of the low in American colonial society. Many of them were indentured servants. Nearly all of them were poor. Okay? And the only options many of them had was to join the army. If you actually read court martials from the period, what you find is like one Irishman after another being brought up on charges, usually for running away, drinking, fighting, that kind of thing. The fighting Irish, as it were. So the army now, many people have fought, they've borne arms. What are you going to do? And some of them were actually saying that maybe they should mutiny. Maybe they should mutiny at the time. Some of them hadn't been paid. What does that mean? How are you going to deal with them? All of these pressures that I'm talking about culminated in 1786 in western Massachusetts in an incident that we know now as Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion was quite simple. It was that people in eastern Massachusetts were trying to get their money that Westerners owed them. And so they were foreclosing on farms, they were calling in debts, they were refusing to kind of loosen up the currency so that people could pay back their debts. And as this happened, these Westerners say, enough is enough. And they used the old ways they had of organizing now to organize, if you will, a citizens' army to fight against what they regarded as a corrupt regime. A regime that was intent on rolling anything back the revolution was intended to fix. And they had lots of followers. They raid an arsenal in Springfield, and people in Massachusetts who were freaked out asked the government, okay, under the Articles of Confederation, to send an army to crush them. They can't do that. What are they going to do? They're completely impotent. And what do the merchants do? They raise an army of their own. They get none other than Benjamin Lincoln, the guy I told you in the image before, who actually would receive the sword for George Washington. He's brought out of the mothballs, and he's sent up now to put down this Shays Rebellion. This is the immediate context of what goes on when it comes to the Constitution. And the Constitution responded to all of these issues. They didn't only respond to the tensions and the problems, it also responded to what this context allowed and what it did not. And that's what I want to turn my attention to now, and just kind of finish up with kind of a little understanding of the Constitution itself. Now, Madison was clearly responding to the anxieties of the age, without a doubt. And Shays Rebellion was something that deeply upset him because he saw this as indicative of all the things that were happening in America at the time. At first he said, we have to get a convention that's going to amend the Articles. But he knew that would never do. He was going to go and call together a bunch of people in Philadelphia to start afresh, to start anew. And that's why he has to enlist Washington and Franklin immediately, because he thinks it's that dire, that the whole revolution could be completely undone in all the kinds of ways that I've explained. And immediately, he more or less comes up with an idea that was going to be central to the Constitution. The central government had to be powerful. No ifs, ands, or buts, no debate about it. Now, we often think of the Constitution as pitting different groups against one another. But actually, there's a broad consensus about this. Really, everybody understood the new government had to be more efficacious. It had to be orderly. It had to be able to bring authority to bear, to rein in all of these issues and tensions and problems I talked about. Everybody believed in that, but the devil was going to be in the details. What was the sovereignty ultimately going to look like? And this was not an easy issue. Sovereignty was the fundamental one. You need sovereignty, but how can it look like? And this is where I think you begin to see the genius of people like Madison. The genius was in his ability to read the situation and to understand and recognize what the situation would allow. What would that situation allow and not allow? One thing that you couldn't do is you couldn't kind of put the people back in a box. You couldn't forget what had happened. You could not turn your back on the fact that these people had fought, that these people had sacrificed. That was an animating fact of the moment. You also had to recognize that all of these different countries in America were different countries, that they all had pretensions to sovereignty. And so he comes up with an idea of sovereignty that is actually the most elegant and beautiful fudge one could possibly imagine. One in which the central government will be sovereign, but the states will kind of be sovereign, and the people will sort of be sovereign. We think of our thing as a beautiful design, as if it's given from on high by God to Madison himself as a pure spark of genius. Madison is scrambling with a context that does not allow a lot of room, and that's his genius. The ability to maneuver, to negotiate, to think through what is possible and what is not. Other things that you're going to see in the Constitution. As I said before, you have to recognize that people had been politicized for a long period of time, and they are very conscious of that politicization. So you have to create a legislature that recognizes that, but a legislature that's not going to be held hostage by it. And that's why the House of Representatives is going to be the most representative of institutions. It's going to meet once every 2 years. Some people said, make it once every 1 year. And everybody said, no way. They tried that in Pennsylvania. How about a unicameral legislature? Oh no, that was tried in Pennsylvania. Utter, absolute disaster. That's what we don't want. We know we're going to have a bicameral legislature. Why? To mute the voice of the people. You have to recognize them, but at the same time you have to create an orderly sort of government. Now we often think of this as kind of, the great compromise. How small states were going to fight the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan was going to offer something different. The New Jersey plan was never one, however, that was going to say, we got to recognize the voice of these people. Only 1 or 2 people speaks up for them at the Constitutional Convention. Benjamin Franklin is one. He's not even listened to. Not even listened to. Everyone's on the same page. When they get down to brass tacks, to actually try to figure out what the plan is going to be, that's when the so-called compromise emerges. And where they come up with an idea that you can have each state being represented equally in the Senate, and of course people would not elect the Senate, state legislatures did. That again was to be a buffer to the people, and it would only be the House of Representatives that would truly be the representative body of this legislature. How about the executive? Well, of course, they famously came up with the Electoral College. And think of the Electoral College however you wish. Lots of debate about that. But I can tell you this much. These guys did not have much of a clue how it was going to work. The Electoral College, frankly, was a punt. If the first was a fudge, the second was a punt. They were not quite sure how it was going to work, but they realized again that you had to protect or buffer the institutions of government from direct democratic input. There's also one other thing, I think, most importantly, that the Constitution does. The Constitution lays it out in the preamble. And if you've listened to, that like education, grammar rock kind of thing, you know how to sing it. We the people in order to form a more perfect union, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to understand what the Constitution means, read the preamble over slowly. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the common defense, provide the common defense, promote the general welfare, and the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. This sums up what it was all about. If you think about the preamble, fundamentally what it's saying is we have been in an anarchic state of nature. We are now entering a state of society. We have been in a revolutionary world where everything is turned upside down. We are now establishing proper bases for how society is going to work. And it opens up with exactly the 3 most important words. We the people. This, again, was not just something the founders dreamt up. It was something that had become animating fact in America at the time. Now, even though it provided for a stable government, it didn't mean it was a just government. Whole people were going to be written out of this equation in order to ensure that some people got what they wanted to sustain order. Who's going to be written out? there's going to be no mention made of women. Women are going to be regarded, after this time, for some period at least, as being the cultural conservators of American virtue. That's going to be their role. In other words, they're going to acknowledge the fact that women had sacrificed through the revolution, but women were not going to inherit political roles immediately. They were citizens. They were non-political citizens. Who else is going to be excluded? Slaves. African Americans are going to be excluded from this. They are mentioned in the Constitution as, quote, all other persons. All other persons. Now, why did this happen? It happened because delegates from South Carolina and Georgia immediately said, when the Constitutional Convention got together in this room, there was a South Carolinian who said, we've got to keep the windows shuttered so nobody can hear what actually happens in here. They said, if anybody is going to mention about abolishing slavery, we are gone. They played brinksmanship with the rest of the people in the convention. Now, some Northerners fulminated against it. They talked about how unjust this is, this institution. How could they do this kind of thing? But here's the most problematic aspect of the Constitution. They gave in. They gave in. The Constitution put slavery in a lockbox. Of that, there is no doubt. You often hear about the 3/5 compromise, and that word compromise is put next to it. Okay? And we think that it means kind of a compromise between the way that we think about the full humanity of a person. But it wasn't a compromise. That 3/5 was an older, colonial era holdover, a way of apportioning representation that was brought up at this time, and everyone signs onto it. There was no compromising involved, none whatsoever. The Constitution enshrined slavery at this moment. Native Americans, okay, are excluded also. They will largely be living by sign across different sorts of lines after treaties are signed that are going to exclude them from the body politic. If they were to become civilized with time, they could indeed become citizens. But if they decided to live out west, they would actually be their own nations and would be, in theory anyway, left unmolested. Although, of course, this wouldn't happen. So, this is the story, in many ways, of the Constitution. This is what happened in this place. But one other thing did happen as well. And this gets us back to understand what went on in this room, but more importantly, why we always look to this room. You see, people at the time, when they were signing this document, understood everything I'm talking about. None of this would have come as a surprise. They understood all of these things. They understood how violent this revolution was. What happens immediately after this is we begin to get a revolution in which the founders were going to play predominant roles. I think this happens for a very important reason. Americans, anyway, had to sign all kinds of trade-offs to bring their revolution to an end. They had to sign unjust deals. They had to make all sorts of compromises in order to bring order back to a society that had teetered on the brink because of revolutionary violence. And these contradictions would be borne on the shoulders of the founders. The people exonerated themselves from these compromises, from these issues, from these deals, by having the founders be the one who's ultimately responsible. And you can almost say it's from this moment, really in the 1790s, especially with George Washington's death in 1799, that you start seeing almost a cult of the founders. In other words, we got the revolution settled. We got the Constitution that we deserved, or the only one that could have been achieved, if you will, given America's history and given the violence and uncertainty of the preceding period. And we are still living with the implications of those trade-offs that occurred in this room through these founders. Thank you very much.
We do have some time for Q&A. If you would kindly stand up and pose your question, I'm sure Dr. Griffin would be happy to answer it.
Or try to.
So you French Revolution, and then the breakdown of continental banking, and then the following purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, where they seem to have a lot of liquid cash, like 50-some million francs, and they also relieved Napoleon of a debt obligation, which somehow had accrued over such a short period of time. So why is that?
That's a great question, Matt. Thank you. It's a great question in a couple kinds of ways. First off, let's get to the first things first. These things were always deadlines, and when things had to be paid back, interest amounts were always fungible because they were being continually negotiated and renegotiated. Okay, so there's never one time that you can say this debt is going to be owed in a certain period of time, because it's always in flux. More important is the second part and third part of your question, is how are they going to get these finances in order in a short period of time? Okay, the answer is actually Washington, D.C. Okay, not because it's fixed in Washington, D.C., it's ultimately because we're going to have a capital in Washington, D.C. All right, and this has to do with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Okay, Hamilton was a guy, he believed he knew how to fix the debt issue. First off, you get kind of a good person to head up finance, Robert Morris. He was good, okay? And he knows that these things have to be tackled head on. And you have to figure out a way of actually raising money. Well, Madison's going to come up with that part. And that's going to be by yoking taxation to representation. Before then, there have been different ways of doing it. Should taxation be based on land? Should it be based on headcount? By yoking taxation to representation, this, by the way, was a way that some Northerners swallowed the 3/5 idea, because it meant that Virginia's going to be paying more money. So Virginia may have more representation, South Carolina may have more representation because of slaves, but on the other hand, they'd have to pay more back. And so you start getting money that's coming into the Treasury because of that. But most importantly, what was needed was going to be a good financial plan where you're going to have wealthy backers in America support you. And that's what Hamilton really aims to do. And that means you have to have a bank, which is something that someone like Jefferson didn't want to touch at all, because he worried banks lead to speculation and the wrong kind of socioeconomic development. Hamilton said, no, if we want to finance ourselves as a modern state, we're going to need a bank in order to do so. And so they come up with a compromise. They moved the capital from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. that Jefferson really wanted. He hated Philadelphia. Okay? He hated Philadelphia. Instead, he wanted to send it to the malarial swamp. That's what it was. It was a malarial swamp, and it was close to beloved Virginia, because he thought that that more or less kind of dovetailed with the bucolic ideal of what the American Republic was supposed to look like. And then that meant then that they had a bank. So in other words, in short order then, Americans are able to do well. They're also able to do well because when they're in the doldrums early on, with the wars and tensions between Britain and France, just what you're talking about, we're getting to that last point right now, okay? American traders slip in and they're able to start making money. So the economy starts humming at that time because of the war. All right? So after a while, very quickly early on, particularly because of the Constitution, because of some of these arrangements that are being made, they're able to kind of make themselves solvent once more. And as they do so, then they have kind of the money to do what they need to do. All right? So then it comes to, I remember the first part. We'll talk. Maybe I'll talk to you afterwards about the French Revolution relationship. I'll just say this much anyway. So the Louisiana Purchase, the interesting thing about it is it's going to be using American money to kind of pay the French in order to take over this territory. Jefferson himself would have been aghast at this idea because it's not in the Constitution. He also would have been aghast at this idea because it took a lot of banking know-how. But he said, these are little sacrifices we need to make to double the size of the nation. Not because he was crazy about land, but he thought that his Republican experiment could go on in perpetuity, because now you could have a yeoman farmers' republic that could just spread across space. That was his hope and his dream. So the gist of the answer to everything you've asked is that they're able to right the ship in very short order. But I can tell you this, they would not have righted that ship if this Constitution had not been passed. Great question.
Okay, you were talking about the Electoral College, I guess how that lunches against the idea of mob rule. And can you expand more about that? I guess how the founders kind of view the people of the day and their comment, what they thought of themselves compared to the people that they represent.
So that's a great question too. Okay, so this gets to attitudes. It gets fundamentally to attitudes. When it came to electing a president, all right, one thing is that Americans were going to have divisions of powers, right? We know that. and saying, oh my God, that's a great innovation. Colonial governments did this all the time. There was nothing that was really new about this at all. It was just made good sense that they were going to do these things. The question is, what is this so-called president going to look like? Hell, Americans didn't even know what to call Your Highness, Your Excellency. What's the term going to be? Everything sounded too aristocratic, too monarchical for their ears. But they knew that they needed more than a figurehead, and they knew that they needed something that was going to be quasi-monarchical, to keep the lid on society as much as possible. The executive power in the United States is formidable, and it was formidable at the time. The Electoral College, however, was a way of, if you will, kind of blunting some of that. All right? How did it blunt some of that? Well, first off, people were saying, how long should the president be elected for? They came up with 4 years. Now, in electoral terms, for Americans at this time, 4 years is a lifetime. They were really deeply upset by the sense that one person could be elected and untouched for 4 years. Staggeringly long. The Electoral College then was also meant, as I said before, to be a buffer between the people and between the election of this person with this formidable power. Now, how does this get to the attitudes at the time? Americans lived in a Republican society. That did not mean that it was a society necessarily of equals, but it was ideally a society in which Republican simplicity was going to be the way that people styled themselves. But they realized, or believed anyway, some people, by dint of education, by dint of experience, were necessarily more virtuous than others. Whereas in the old world, okay, the world that, when I was laying the question down about the French Revolution, the world of the ancien regime is where one's status was premised upon things like birth. Okay? And that clearly had been the way that it was in Britain. In America at the time, that could not be the differentiating point between different people and between their value. They began talking about the idea of virtue. And virtue was a way that people could look down their noses at some of the other people, even as they had to, if you will, recognize the sacrifices that they had made. Now, I should mention one thing too. It doesn't mean that the Constitution was immediately accepted by everybody. Lots of people had problems with it. Lots of people had problems with it. And they had problems on exactly the very point that you're talking about. They would have said, and some said, this was an aristocratic document. That's what this thing is. This is one's intent is to look down its noses at us, the common folks who had done the bleeding, the dying, and the fighting at the time of the War of Independence. But nearly everybody would have understood that efficacious government was necessary. It was just going to be a question of what kind of efficacious government was going to be. Great question.
You talked a little bit about an overemphasis on the founders and the great men of the revolution, kind of at the expense of the context around them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this is a problem that's more or less unique to revolutionary history, or is this a problem with history in general?
I think it's a problem, and that's another wonderful question. It's something, let's put it this way, focus upon so-called great men is a way for us to kind of deal with very abstract and complex kinds of ideas in a dramatically complicated context in a shorthand fashion. That's one thing that we do. The past is a really complex one. It's a really complex world, and if we wallow in that complexity without making sense of it, without coming up with any kind of meaning, then we've kind of turned our back on what we're supposed to do. Our job as historians, and your job as historians, our job together as citizens, is try to recognize all that complexity as best we possibly can, and try to understand simplicity through it. I think by just focusing on the founders sometimes, we ignore some of that complexity, because that complexity is difficult, and at the time it was painful to deal with, okay? So this is something that all revolutionary societies have to do. They don't want to deal with the trauma, they don't want to deal with the pain, they don't want to deal with the memories of that uncertainty. And if you make a revolution, more or less one that occurs in a room in Philadelphia, what you've done is you have kind of, I think, psychically dealt with some of those issues that were so profoundly disturbing to lots of people. But it's interesting when you were asking the question about other revolutions, because not every revolution follows this. The French Revolution. When you think of our day, right, our birthday, the central point when it comes to kind of American self-conception and self-understanding, it's this, the Declaration of Independence, same room again, Declaration of Independence. This is what you could almost refer to as our vanishing point. It's the point to which all of our history moves toward, all of our history moves from, that it becomes a touchstone for how we measure ourselves and how we think about ourselves and how we value ourselves. This is our magic revolutionary moment. It's a founder's moment, just like this painting by John Trumbull suggests. French, though, have a very different moment. Theirs is the Bastille. Theirs is the Bastille. This is where common people stormed a medieval prison in France in 1789. It's a very different foundational moment. I think it also deals with kind of a different society that also had suffered this kind of crack of sovereignty where people were competing with one another, where the Furies were unleashed, and where people struggled with one another to try to reconstitute sovereignty in some sort of meaningful fashion. And it was going to be much more perplexing for the French to deal with because of the nature of that revolution. The nature of that revolution means it goes back to that, and I think that speaks, if you will, to the rather almost unfinished revolution that was going to define the French experience. You had some French historians claiming as late as 1989. Hey, 1989, French Revolution is not yet over. You know, it's amazing when you think about that. In America, we never speak about those terms. The latest, you could say, the end date for the American Revolution would be 1865, and that's really pushing it down the road. That's the very latest, when the most rotten, awful aspects of the things I've talked about here were finally dealt with in a fundamental kind of way. When those contradictions that this society could not live with, and even the founders themselves could not deal with, when those were finally rectified. Before we got to that moment, though, it was even Lincoln going back over and over and over again to the founders. And so when he's on the battlefield of Gettysburg, and he's trying to memorialize that moment, he starts, of course, with the words, 7 years ago. What's 7 years from where he was? Right back there, 1776. He always refers to it because it's his touchstone. It still is ours, I think, for many of those reasons. But other countries have different sorts of touchstones, depending upon their different kind of revolutionary experience. Great question.
So, when you were talking about before that some certain states were wandering to a life like the British, some
Yep.
Spanish. So in the Constitutional Convention, there were like a certain number of deputies that could join from each state. And then when you mentioned the aristocratic paper, like when I think about Constitutional Convention, I think about George Washington, one of the wealthiest men in the country back then. So do we have like people in the Constitutional Convention from the same social classes, or we had different social classes there?
They were remarkably similar. Okay, they were well-to-do merchants. Many of them were lawyers. Many of them were people who would have been high-up military officers. Okay, they would have been these people, these virtuous folks that I'm talking about. That's not all of them, all right? But that's the vast majority. And even those people who consider themselves like leading set of, shall we say, anti-federalists, like Patrick Henry from Virginia. Patrick Henry, by the way, he didn't have a problem with power at all. He liked power. All right, but the problem was where the power was. He wanted the power to be in Virginia. That's where he wanted the power, and that's why he didn't want to take part in this. But he was wealthy as well. You know, so I think for the most part, you're dealing with people who are necessarily well off. So even though the deferential attitudes had more or less kind of melted away, the people that here are going to be representing this crew are still going to be the folks, you know, who are what we regard as kind of the virtuous. So Washington wasn't exceptional at all. Washington was different. The only thing that made Washington different was his kind of sense, his bearing, more than anything else. His bearing was really almost like strikingly regal. He was a very aloof kind of character. He didn't let many people close to him because he was always kind of full of the sense of self-presentation. What are other people thinking of him at the time? And he read all kinds of manner books. He even stood a certain kind of way. He spoke a certain kind of way because he wanted people to think of him that way. He was almost like kind of like a statue looking for a pedestal. That's what George Washington really was as a person. And I think many of the images that we have of him mark that out there. I'll just point this one out, you know. But this is actually an earlier one. This is before George Washington became that. I love this one because this is one of the interesting ones in all of American history. This is 1772, okay? 1772. A painter had come around to the area to do different sorts of paintings of some of the well-to-do people, and so he stops by Mount Vernon, and Charles Wilson Peale the painter stops there, and Washington, he asked Washington, do you want a painting done? Of course, says, no, I don't want it all. Martha insists, because there was one also in the entryway, and she wanted one made of that could match it. And so he says, oh, okay, I'll sit for a painting. And that's indeed what he does. So what does he don in the painting? It's 1772. His British uniform. His British uniform. Because more than anything else, he wanted to be considered a British officer. His dream was to be a general in the British Army. And there's a little thing about the American Revolution. There would have been no revolution, some people claim, if the British would have just made George Washington a general. That's all they had to do. Problem solved. I don't think that's the case. But the really cool thing about this is, I mean, he didn't even fix this thing. One of his actual buttons is gone. And I would dare say George put a few pounds on, okay, since the time he was serving as an officer in the Virginia militia that was serving with the British Army at the time. He changes throughout the war. He changes. And part of that change is he wanted at first to be regarded then as a general who could be kind of on an equal plane with European generals, and then he wanted to be regarded as a statesman who could be regarded that way as well.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Griffin.